What's good, y'all? It's your boy Coffee Kid back with another episode of The Observation where we talk about what it was and what it is. Today we have a piece done by a YouTuber on the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. Some pre-context. I mean, it'll touch it in the video, but essentially the colonizers of this age in this race for Africa were Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, Austria, Russia, etc., etc., etc. At this point in time, the land of Africa was contentious between these, Europeans. They were fighting with each other over the land, the resources, and the race to become the most powerful country with the most powerful currency, kind of by default. If you had the most power, you obviously control a lot of other things, including the financial system. But due to their conflict, they decided to meet in Berlin to figure out how they can share Africa and exploit Africa equally. I think it's worth noting that all of these nations are doing so under the moral pretense of Christianity, under the moral pretense of being godly. So I think that's an interesting point to acknowledge. And it reminds me of, before I start into this video, it reminds me of this verse from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 11, where you have Paul, who I've mentioned in previous videos, writing to the church in Corinth, in Greece, and warning them, or I guess not warning them, but directing them on how to propagate the church and live by the gospel, knowing what they knew now after the death of Jesus Christ. And it is a couple days after Easter, or the resurrection. So but yeah, before I read the verse, he's basically telling them that there will be liars and there will be immoral swindlers in the church, so be wary and swift in your handling of them. And he's talking about in the church. He says that don't stop what you're doing outside of the church for those who do not yet know what is true. But those who are in the church who do these things, be careful. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all, meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. So, like he said, he's not saying don't associate with the immoral people of this world, because in that case, you would have to leave this world, right? But he's saying be especially careful of those who propagate themselves as sisters in the body of Christ, but who are doing these things of greed and immoral behaviors. So I think just keep that in mind, having understood the context of what's going on in Africa at this time and what their purpose is in Africa. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
The Berlin Conference formalized the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble, a term coined by the British around 1884, was a period of time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries where several European powers explored, divided, and conquered the continent of Africa. The Berlin Conference was a series of negotiations between 13 European nations and the United States, where these major forces met to decide how they would pursue the division of unclaimed African territory. This conference spanned over 4 months, from November 15th, 1884 to February 26th, 1885. By the end of the conference, these powers decided how they would divide Africa amongst themselves, producing, other than the established boundaries between colonies, the 1885 General Act. This act declared the neutrality of the Congo River Basin, guaranteed freedom for trade and shipping for all states in the basin, forbade the slave trade, and rejected Portugal's claims to the Congo River estuary, thus making possible the founding of the independent Congo Free State by Belgium. This is important because prior to the scramble, Europe had been slow to realize the benefits of claiming African land. Until the 1870s, they were mainly claiming coastal colonies, primarily along the Mediterranean and the African Deep South. Before the conference, European diplomacy in Africa was practiced in the same manner as in the Americas, forming trade relationships with tribe leaders. Other than trading posts along its coast, Africa was largely ignored. However, this changed as a result of Belgium's King Leopold II. By the mid-19th century, Africa was seen as ripe for potential for exploration, trade, and colonization. In 1876, King Leopold II announced his plan to fund an expedition to explore the Congo and followed through in 1879 by sending Sir Henry Morton Stanley there. In that same year, France began to build a railway located east of Dakar, the capital of current-day Senegal, in the hopes of tapping into potentially large markets in the Sahel region of Africa. They also joined Great Britain in seizing financial control over Egypt. From 1879 to 1885, Stanley was situated in the Congo as an envoy for King Leopold II, who sent Stanley with the secret agenda of creating the Congo Free State, a large Belgian commercial endeavor in the Congo. France found out Leopold's plans, though, and proceeded to organize its own colonial expansion. French naval officer Pierre de Brazza was dispatched to Central Africa when he traveled to the Congo Basin and claimed territory for France. Meanwhile, Portugal, who already had treaties in place with the Congo Empire, joined this race and quickly formed a treaty with its old ally, the United Kingdom, to block off the Congo Free State's access to the Atlantic. As a result of Stanley's chartering in the Congo Basin, the spheres of control between nations such as Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium were more clearly outlined. In the coming years, various European powers raced to claim more land and eliminate any minor local rulers with the potential of disrupting European agendas. As France expanded its territory in Africa, such as what is now the Republic of the Congo, as well as Guinea, they inadvertently partially convinced Italy to join the Triple Alliance, an agreement between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and now Italy. In doing so, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's carefully laid plans for Italy were disrupted, forcing Germany to get involved into the affair. Germany joined the others in the race to claim parts of Africa, thus posing a threat to the others, especially Britain and France. As tensions rose, Leopold was able to convince Britain and France that free trade between the colonies would be in their best interests. Supported by Britain and with the initiative taken by Portugal, Otto von Bismarck organized an international conference in Berlin to work out a common policy regarding colonization, trade, and the official partitioning of Africa. Representatives from Austria-Hungary, Belgium, the United Kingdom, France, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States all attended this conference. Although it did not start the partitioning of Africa, the Berlin Conference did result in consequences that impacted the continent as a whole, even to this day. In establishing the rules for conquest and partitioning of Africa, it legitimized the concept of Africa being a mere playground for outside forces. Its abundance of resources was essentially free for foreign powers to seize, without a moment of consideration for the native people living on the continent. Given how the main priorities of this conference were to establish methods of economic advancement for the foreign powers involved, it is clear that the welfare of natives was an afterthought. From the very start, the conference laid out its chief priorities, and I quote, "The powers are in the presence of three interests: that of the commercial and industrial nations, which a common necessity compels to the research of new outlets; that of the states, of the powers summoned to exercise over the regions of the Congo, an authority which will have burdens corresponding to their rights; and, lastly, that which some generous voices have already commended to your solitude, the interests of the native populations." Despite maintaining the position that they cared about the native populations, they resolutely refused to consider the question of sovereignty and the legitimacy of laying claim to someone else's land and resources. Bismarck even stated, I quote, in their opening remarks that delegates had not been assembled to discuss matters of sovereignty either of African states or of the European powers in Africa. In addition, their lack of respect for the native Africans was also made abundantly clear in how no Africans were included in the conference, and how the Sultan of Zanzibar was ridiculed for his attempts to be invited. One of the most significant consequences on the short-term scale was how Europeans used their claims as an excuse to exploit the continent, taking raw materials and using natives for underpaid menial labor. Infrastructural improvements were made in order to exploit raw materials, as opposed to helping the indigenous people of Africa. The principle of effective occupation that was established at the conference meant that European powers had to physically establish control over areas to claim them. The Europeans began to use force, if necessary, in their quest to gain new territories. The Congo Free State became the site of terrible crimes as Leopold II deputized forces to seize rubber, ivory, and other materials by terrorizing and brutalizing the local people. Additionally, in the First World War, countries such as France and Britain used natives in order to fill their ranks, even though the natives did not have any attachment to Europe. On a larger scale, the conference had the detrimental effect upon the infrastructure of several African countries. Despite achieving independence for the most part in the 1950s and 1960s, many African countries have continued along the destructive path established in Berlin. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere declared, and I quote, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884, and today we are struggling to build these nations into stable units of human society. We are in danger of becoming the most balkanized continent of the world." As a result of several colonial powers imposing their own boundaries on the continent, entire groups of people, conflicting or otherwise, were separated or forced together. When these countries became independent, they ended up having ethnic conflicts, further weakening them. By the time these countries regained their independence, they had accumulated a history of conflict and potential fragmentation that could not be disregarded, eliminated, or made to operate properly. Before the conference, only 20% of Africa was under European control. Following the acceleration in colonizing caused by the organization provided by the conference, by 1914, 90% of Africa was under the thumb of various European countries. The only exceptions were Ethiopia, named at the time Abyssinia, Liberia, and the Dervish state, which is a small portion of what is now Somalia. Following the conference, Africa was divided between 13 of the powers from the conference. However, establishing political boundaries was the easy part. As a result of their decided strategy of effective occupation, they were able to capture geometric portions of African land, with boundaries that did not consider native tribes, cultures, or groups occupying the area. These boundaries separated ethnic groups and pushed opposing groups together. In order to govern the territory seized, they had to surmount a confusing amount of fluid identities, cultures, traditions, and languages. In order to handle this, the Europeans reorganized the native Africans into groups and units they could understand and easily control. Oxford University professor Terence Ranger stated that this period was marked by, I quote, systemic inventions of African traditions, ethnicity, customary law, traditional religion. Before colonialism, Africa was characterized by pluralism, flexibility, multiple identity. After it, African identities of tribe, gender, generation were all bound by the rigidities of invented tradition. A product of this reorganization is the languages spoken by different countries in Africa. Countries such as Cameroon, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Burkina Faso speak French due to being in the French sphere of influence. On the other hand, Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, amongst others, speak English because Britain controls those areas. Considering how the conference accelerated and formalized the actions that would end ancestral life in numerous African countries, there was not much that stayed the same amongst them. Daily life was drastically altered, with citizens being separated from their identifying groups and categorized in a Eurocentric manner with blatant disregard for the fluidity of their cultures. If you liked this video, please check.
Very interesting. A lot to unpack, but what first comes to mind is, I think, the pretense of the Berlin Conference itself. Why they even gathered and bothered to meet. You know, if you're gathering heads of states like that, especially at a time like this where a meeting like that is a huge deal. You don't have digital mediums of communication or more immediate, instantaneous ways to communicate. So this is a huge effort, and transportation is also not as easy. This is a huge effort, meaning the stakes in the agendas of the meeting are pivotal to the power structures that these countries are trying to propagate. So I think the pretense of the meeting in and of itself is very, very, very interesting to me. And one question, and I don't know the answer to this, that I would like to pose for anyone who's watching is how many in the African diaspora are aware of this conference and are aware of even some of the more the fluid nature of African traditions before colonialism, right? Because you see the pivotal kind of game that allowed the transition of colonial power and the exploitation of resources was division amongst the people, which I've talked about in previous videos. You see the grayed out area is split homelands. This is regions that were split by the division of Africa into these European controlled city states, right? And even more so, another map was interesting to me. Where was it? Yeah. This map about the Eurocentric Fed culture, right? So these people over this, really 60, 70 plus year span of rapid colonization, rapid forced labor, rapid exploitation, lost their traditions. You can see their oral traditions. You can see their cultural traditions, their customary way of their nature, as he put it, was very much Pan-African. They were very much adaptable in how they crossed cultures. So aside from the land, aside from the money, the resources exploited, and the labor exploited, we have an exploitation of the mind, which is something that is invisible and it's lost. Once you lose that, how do you teach a lost state of mind to the current generation? And my question earlier was, how many Africans across the diaspora even know about that root issue of this division, on top of the more tangible things that we see, like that the Berlin Conference did. Aside from the intangibles, which a lot of people don't know about, a lot of people don't even know about just the sheer exploitation of resources. And if they do across the diaspora, they choose to turn a blind eye, because the infrastructure of Europe and the United States is much more built out. It's easier to get a job in the United States. There's more Nigerian physicians in New York than there is in Nigeria. Same with Ghana. Same with not just physicians. Same with, accounting, finance, lawyers. They're more prevalent in these former colonizing countries because the infrastructure was able to be propagated. So it's unfortunate how Africa was really truly dined on and still is. It's pretty clear to me that the effects of the Berlin Conference have never gone. They have never gone away. Africa is still lost. The diaspora is still asleep in their, well, how should I put this? They're still asleep in their, I guess, anguish to these facts. This does not inspire people to act. People don't want to move back to Africa and fix these things. And people don't want to gather their human resources and cognitive resources to go back and be problem solvers in their motherland. I promise you they don't want to across the diaspora. Our diaspora is divided as to what the current state of the world is. So the resolution, I think, first is within the mind, right? Because yes, we have a problem with Africa being exploited as a resource. We have a problem with the finance system keeping Africa in a perpetual debt, to where 1/3 of Africa's GDP collective is going to debt repayment to these Eurocentric countries. So the finance system really keeps Africa down, even though the owners of these financial systems need Africa to sustain their economies. They need Africa. Africa gets terrible credit ratings. terrible. Yet 1/3 of our GDP has been continually going to our debt repayment for X amount of years. Tell me, make that make sense. Why we're crippled by debt? So, does the diaspora care about the resource exploitation? Do they care about the coup d'etats propagated by various European and American entities? Do they care about, the lack of infrastructure? Do they care about the resources not being manufactured in the country, no value being added to the raw materials in the continent of Africa? The value is added in Europe, and manufacturing plants outside of Africa is where the value is added. Does the diaspora care about that? I would argue yes. But those are all above ground issues. Underground, within our conscious and within our mind, does the diaspora care about galvanizing their people to learn these types of things, or learn about our lost ways of knowing, or learn about peace, sanctity in a Pan-African identity, of unifying our conscience? Does the diaspora care about that? I would say less care about that, or would testify to that reality, than would testify to the obvious glaring reality that Africa is being exploited, right? But you can't solve the symptoms without solving the root issue, in my opinion. That's just my observation. When look at the map, when they split the cultural ways of knowing and the identity and propagated Eurocentric cultures, laws, behaviors, a sense of inferiority set in. And I think it still exists today, an inferiority complex in the minds of Africans, to where the diaspora would much rather live in the current infrastructure of Europe or America. It reminds me of Moses, the story of Moses in Egypt, right? When Pharaoh was killing the firstborn, Moses' parents, out of faith, sent him down the river in hopes that he would not be murdered, because Pharaoh was against the spread of the Israeli people, because they had become strong after being in Egypt, strong in numbers, I should say. He was fearful of that, for better or for worse. So now Moses gets picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, grows up in royalty, right? He's taken in by Pharaoh's family. That's a whole nother story as to how he even got taken in, right? Because you would think Pharaoh would want to kill a Hebrew boy. So Pharaoh obviously didn't know that this boy was Hebrew, but that's probably up for historical debate. But regardless of that fact, the Israelis are being they're building the infrastructure of Egypt. All the great statues that you see in Egypt, built on the backs of slaves, Israeli slaves. And you have Moses, an Israeli, a Hebrew, growing up in royalty. He grows up. He leaves. And he's like, I want to see my people. Because he knows that he's not truly Egyptian. So he sees his people. He sees them suffering. He sees them being exploited. He sees them being, harshly treated. And he feels a yearning in his heart, in his conscience, to gap that divide that he feels with his people who are in slavery in Egypt at the hands of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. He sees an Egyptian man beating a guard, beating on a slave. And this gap in his conscience is so strong, it causes him to kill the Egyptian. He runs away because he killed the Egyptian. He also tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews. to no avail, because he's trying to break up these two fights, this division between people who are supposed to be brothers, right? And they say, bro, get out of here. Like, who are you? Who are you to step in as if you know our problems? As if you know why we're even in conflict as brothers, right? They would rather remain in conflict and remain divided in their consciousness as brothers and remain in turmoil with each other than hear this guy named Moses, who grew up in royalty and is disconnected, than hear his plea for them to unite as a people, because there's division amongst the slaves, the Israeli slaves themselves. So what does that not have a lot of undertones to what's going on now? If you look at the diaspora, right? Those Israelis would prefer to stay under the rule and in the infrastructure of Egyptian rule, regardless of the suffering that it brought, than to be united cognitively together. Now, later on in the story of Moses, that gets changed, but it's a lot of similar undertones to the diaspora, our cognitive separation from each other. Logically, it makes sense to unite Africa. Logically, it makes sense to put our cultural, linguistic differences aside in hopes of creating a united Africa that can reap our resources, kick out these multinational companies who are really just neo-colonizers, create manufacturing opportunities, add value to the resources that we have, create infrastructure that allows trade across the continent. You would think, right? But the diaspora and those within Africa would rather submit to the current infrastructure because it's easier and it's more reliable and it's more safe. Right? The resistance to change is often not worth the solution. And that is the case here. But who am I? Who am I to say? That's just an observation. But nevertheless, it's interesting how this was done on, the pretense of Christianity, when clearly it was done off the pretense of greed. Very, very far from anything in the scriptures. But nevertheless, the scriptures said, be wary of that. Be wary of those who align themselves with the faith, but yet behave in the contrary. So with that, another episode of The Observation. I'm going to leave it there. I hope y'all enjoyed the commentary from the standpoint of, agreement, disagreement, added thoughts. Please feel free to comment, share, another fact or another thing that may or may not align, in the hopes of creating more dialogue. I'm always happy to jump in the comments. Like, subscribe, turn on the bell notifications if you enjoy this type of content and want more. I'll be dropping it weekly, but with that being said, it's been another episode of The Observation, where we talk about what it was and what it is, with your boy, Coffee Kid, man. Take it easy, y'all. Until next time.